abandoned in the cold. The night a duke took her in and changed everything. The blizzard didn't care that Helena Todd was dying. It swept through the alley the way it always did, indifferent, relentless, swallowing the gaslight whole until London looked like nothing more than a ghost of itself. She had counted every cobblestone beneath her boots. 37. She knew because there was nothing else to do while the cold worked its way through the thin wool of her dress and into the marrow of her bones. She had stopped shivering an hour ago, which she understood distantly was not a good sign. The frozen blue ribbon in her fist was all that remained of Todd and Sons. Haberdashers, EST 1841. Her father had tied it around every order himself, a small flourish of pride in an ordinary life. Now it was a relic, a gravestone she could hold. She was waiting, she realized, for the numbness to take her completely, for the cold to finish what Lord Ashworth's lawyers had started 3 weeks ago when they stripped her father's shop down to the bare walls and left him with nothing but a broken heart and a cough that turned to silence by morning. She had no plan beyond surviving until daybreak, and she was beginning to suspect even that was too ambitious. That was when she heard it. The slow, deliberate percussion of iron-shod wheels on wet stone. A carriage, black as a judicial sentence, drawn by horses that steamed in the frozen air, rolled to a halt at the mouth of the alley. It had no business stopping here. Nothing of consequence ever stopped in this alley. The door swung open. The man who filled the frame of it was not what she expected. She had seen his face in the illustrated papers often enough. Shivas Burgess, the Duke of Cravenmore, the man Parliament whispered about and drawing rooms feared. He was said to be carved from the same cold stone as his family crest. He was said to be ruthless in politics, merciless in business, and entirely without sentiment. He looked at her the way a surgeon looks at a wound, assessing, precise, and then he stepped down from the carriage without a word. He placed his coat around her shoulders. It was heavy, warm, and smelled of cedar and something faintly like ink. She stared up at him, too frozen to be properly suspicious. "Can you walk?" he asked. His voice was low, unhurried, as though the snow was not falling and she was not half dead in an alley and none of this was remotely irregular. "I don't know you," she managed. "No," he agreed. "But I knew your father." She did not remember the carriage ride clearly. Later, she would recall the warmth of the coat and the blur of gaslit streets beyond fogged glass, and the strange, suspended feeling of being neither safe nor in danger, of existing in some threshold between the life she had lost and whatever this was. She woke in a canopy bed the size of her father's entire shop. The ceiling above her was plasterwork, vines and roses and the occasional stern-faced cherub, and for one disoriented moment she thought she had died and found herself in some bureaucratic wing of heaven. Then her ribs reminded her sharply that she was alive. The cold had left her stiff and her lungs felt like wrung cloth, but the hearth across the room was blazing with the kind of fire that cost more to maintain in a single evening than she had earned in a month at the shop. He was standing beside it. Shivas Burgess had exchanged his greatcoat for a dark jacket, though he wore it with the same rigid economy of movement, as though even at rest he was engaged in the business of containing something. His hands were clasped behind his back. He did not look at her until she sat up, and when he did, his expression gave nothing away. "You'll want tea," he said. It was not a question. "I'll want an explanation," she replied, and was quietly impressed that her voice came out steadier than she felt. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the ghost of one, documented and dismissed. "Fair enough," he said. "I'll give you both." What he told her, over strong tea and toast she was too proud to eat quickly but too hungry to refuse, was this: the man who had destroyed her father, Lord Ashworth, collector of debts and reputations, was also the man that the Duke of Cravenmore had spent the better part of 2 years trying to bring before a parliamentary inquiry. Ashworth had been stealing from the public purse for a decade, hiding it behind legitimate business ruin. Men like her father, men whose shops and trades and livelihoods provided the perfect cover for financial crimes that went far beyond unpaid loans. Helena Todd, who had spent 3 weeks grieving in rented silence, sat up straighter. "You want to use me," she said. "I want to offer you a choice," he corrected. "Ashworth's circle is impenetrable to me. I am too known, too watched. But a young woman of modest origin, recently bereaved, seeking to better her circumstances, She would not be watched at all. He paused. You would be trained. Presented to society as a distant connection of mine. You would move through his world, attend his gatherings, and tell me what you see. And in return? In return, said Shivas Burgess, the man who killed your father will answer for it. Properly. Legally. Permanently. Helena looked at the fire. She thought of 37 cobblestones and a blue ribbon and the particular quality of cold that comes not from winter but from having nothing left to lose. When do we begin? She asked. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The iron gates of Cravenmore House were not made to be kind. They rose 12 feet from the pavement in black iron spears, topped with gilded points that caught no warmth even in summer. In January, they were simply another edge in a city full of them. Helena had chosen this spot deliberately, not out of any particular hope. Hope had vacated her chest around the same hour the bailiffs vacated the shop, but because the stone wall adjoining the gates was solid, and solid meant windbreak, and windbreak meant perhaps another hour before her body stopped bothering to argue with the cold. She had pulled her knees to her chest and pressed herself into the corner where iron met stone, and she held the ribbon. It was blue, cornflower blue, the shade her father had special ordered every season from a draper on the Strand because he said it was the color of a clear-headed morning, and he wanted every customer who received a parcel from Todd and Sons to begin their day that way. She had found it on the floor after the men left, trodden into the boards, too small to bother taking. She had smoothed it against her coat and kept it, and now her fingers had closed around it so long in the cold that she wasn't sure she could open them again. She heard the carriage before she saw it, the measured clap of hooves on wet stone, unhurried, the sound of something that belonged to the night rather than fleeing it. The vehicle that rounded the corner was large and black, its lanterns throwing amber circles on the slick road, and it slowed as it approached the gates with the practiced ease of long habit. She pressed herself flatter against the stone. She had no wish to be seen, less wish to be moved on. She was not bothering anyone. She was simply existing in a very small way in a very cold corner of London, and she intended to continue doing so until morning gave her a reason to do otherwise. But the carriage stopped. The door opened and a man stepped down, and she knew the face immediately from the papers, the severe line of the jaw, the straight-backed economy of his posture. Shivas Burgess looked at her the way she imagined he looked at most problems. Directly, without the social grace of pretending not to notice. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he crossed the pavement, crouched to her level, an act that seemed to cost his dignity something, and looked at her with eyes that were neither warm nor unkind, simply serious, the way a doctor's eyes are serious. He did not call for a footman. He did not instruct her to rise. He simply gathered her up himself, one arm beneath her knees and one at her back, and carried her through the gates of Cravenmore House as the snow resumed its quiet, indifferent work above them both. She woke to warmth, which was so unexpected it frightened her. Her body registered it before her mind did, the slow, suspicious thaw of limbs that had resigned themselves to a different fate, and she lay very still for a moment, cataloguing the unfamiliar sensations. Linen that had been ironed. A weight of blankets that smelled of lavender and cedar. A ceiling so far above her that it seemed to belong to a different category of room than any she had previously inhabited. The hearth was enormous and burning high, and the man standing beside it had his back to her. He was reading something, letters, she thought, or perhaps parliamentary notes, held at the precise angle of a man accustomed to poor light in late sessions. He had not changed from the night before, or if he had, the replacement was identical. Dark jacket, straight spine, the overall impression of a person who considered stillness a form of discipline. He did not turn when she pushed herself upright, though she knew he heard it. "You'll want tea," he said. "I'll want an explanation," she replied, and was quietly impressed that her voice came out steadier than she felt. He set down his papers and turned then, and in the full light of the room she had her first proper look at him. He was younger than the illustrated papers suggested, or perhaps the papers simply aged everyone they feared. The severity was real enough, nothing soft in the set of his jaw, but the eyes were more complicated than she'd expected. They were the eyes of a man carrying something heavy over a very long distance. He told her, without ceremony, that she could stay. Then he told her what staying would cost. He spoke with the measured efficiency of a man presenting a business arrangement, which she supposed was precisely what it was. Lord Ashworth, the name landed in the room like something dropped from a height, had been systematically defrauding a public infrastructure fund for the better part of a decade. Shivas had the shape of it, the architecture of the crime, but Ashworth was careful and well protected, and his social circle was a fortress that a duke with political enemies could not enter unobserved. A young woman of unremarkable origin, however, recently come to modest misfortune, might move through those rooms invisibly. She would be presented as a distant connection. She would be trained, prepared, given whatever she needed to pass scrutiny. She would attend Ashworth's gatherings, accept his hospitality, and remember everything she heard. "And you think I am capable of that?" she said. It was not quite a question. "I think," said Shivas Burgess, watching her with those careful, weighted eyes, "that you spent last night in a blizzard rather than ask anyone for help. That suggests a considerable capacity for endurance." Helena looked at the fire for a long moment. She thought of her father's hands, tying blue ribbon around parcels for 30 years, and of the silence that had replaced him. "Tell me everything about Ashworth," she said. The house had a language she did not speak. It was not a matter of manners. She had manners enough, the plain functional kind her father had instilled with quiet consistency, but Cravenmore House operated on a register entirely its own. There were rules for which fork preceded which, for how one addressed a visiting earl versus a visiting baron, for the precise angle at which a lady inclined her head when acknowledging someone she considered beneath her notice. There were rules, apparently, for everything except how an ordinary person was supposed to feel standing in the middle of it all, surrounded by things that cost more than her father had earned in his lifetime. She broke the vase on a Tuesday. It was not carelessness, exactly. She had been practicing the particular gliding walk her etiquette tutor insisted upon, weight forward, step small, shoulders back until her spine ached with the architectural ambition of it, and the pedestal had simply been in the wrong place, or she had, and the thing had gone over with a sound like a small, expensive catastrophe. She stood in the wreckage of it and waited. The piece, she would later learn, was Ming. She did not know that then. She knew only that it had been very large and very blue and was now very much in fragments around her feet, and that the footman who appeared in the doorway went the particular shade of pale that precedes either fainting or the fetching of one's employer. Shivas appeared without urgency, as he did most things. He looked at the shards on the floor and then at her, and she kept her chin level and her hands still at her sides because she had decided, in the 10 seconds since the impact, that she would not flinch. Whatever came next, dismissal, anger, the cold arithmetic of what she owed him, she would receive it standing. He crossed the room and crouched beside the largest fragment, turning it over once in his hand. Then he set it down and straightened, and instead of speaking, he did something she had not anticipated. He rolled back his left sleeve. The scar ran from his wrist to the inside of his elbow. Long and pale and old, the kind that comes not from a single clean incident but from sustained proximity to something brutal. "A glass factory in Birmingham," he said, without inflection. "I was 11. The work paid 4 shillings a week." He smoothed the sleeve back down with the same unhurried precision with which he did everything. "The dukedom came to me at 14 through a cousin I had never met. I broke 3 things in my first month here, simply by not knowing where they were." He looked at her then, directly, the way he always did. "We will order another," he said. "In the meantime, the walk requires smaller steps. Lead from the heel, not the toe." He left her standing in the ruins of it, and something in her chest quietly rearranged itself. The transformation, Helena discovered, was a form of controlled suffering. It began before breakfast and continued until the candles burned low, a relentless curriculum designed not merely to teach her but to rebuild her from the structural supports outward. Mrs. Alderton, the etiquette tutor, had the bearing of a woman who had personally witnessed the collapse of several lesser civilizations and attributed each one to poor posture. Monsieur Devereux, imported from Paris at considerable expense and greater inconvenience, taught her French with the patient ferocity of a man who considered linguistic imprecision a moral failing. There was a dancing master, a diction coach, and a woman called simply Madame who arrived every third day to lace her into the corset and observe the results with the detached satisfaction of a sculptor. The harp was the worst of it. She had never played an instrument. Her hands were shop hands, capable, practical, accustomed to wrapping parcels and tallying figures, and the harp required of them something entirely different, a kind of precise delicacy that felt in the early weeks like asking a cart horse to embroider. The strings bit into her fingertips until they bled in thin, neat lines, and she wrapped them each evening in linen strips and unwrapped them each morning and began again, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not something she had any intention of doing. She did not notice him watching. Or rather, she noticed but refused to acknowledge it, which amounted to the same thing in practice. He was there at the edges of it, a silhouette in a doorway during the afternoon French lesson, a stillness in the upper gallery on the evenings she practiced her walking in the long hall. He never interrupted. He never offered commentary. He simply appeared, occasionally, in the peripheral territory of her days, and then was gone before she could properly account for him. Once, late on a Thursday when the house was quiet and her back ached with the particular deep persistence of the long corseted, she was working through a harp passage for the fourth consecutive hour when she struck a clean run. Not perfect, but clean, the notes falling in sequence with something approaching intention, and she heard, from the direction of the doorway, the very slight sound of a breath released. She did not look up. She played the passage again. Later she would think about what it cost a man like Shivas Burgess to be moved by something and to believe himself undetected in it. She would think about the precise quality of that silence. Not the silence of indifference but of a man standing very still because movement might give him away. She had grown up in a small shop watching people reveal themselves in unguarded moments, in the way they handled things they thought no one was observing. She knew what it looked like when someone was trying very hard not to care, and failing quietly in the dark. She had a new name, and it fit her the way the corset did. Precisely, uncomfortably, and by design. Lady Helena Ashford, distant cousin to the Duke of Cravenmore, had arrived in London from the country following a period of quiet mourning for an uncle whose existence Shivas's solicitors had constructed with admirable thoroughness. There was paperwork. There were letters of introduction written in the correct hand on the correct stationery. There was a backstory she had rehearsed until it lived in her mouth as naturally as her own history, which was, she supposed, the point. The Pembroke Ball was chosen as her debut because Ashworth attended it annually, reliably, and with the comfortable arrogance of a man who considered himself a fixture of any room he entered. She had studied his face from a sketch Shivas had procured, sharp-featured, florid, the smile of a man who had never once doubted his own welcome, until she could have identified him in the dark. She did not look for Shivas when she entered. That was the first rule. She moved through the receiving line with her chin at the angle Mrs. Alderton had drilled into her bones, accepted a glass she did not drink, and took her place in the periphery of the room with the calm of someone who had always belonged there. Ashworth found her before the second set. He was the kind of man who collected introductions to young women the way others collected debts, casually, confidently, with no real intention of remembering what he'd acquired. He bowed over her hand and she smiled the smile she had practiced in the mirror until it contained nothing true, and when he asked her to dance she accepted with precisely the degree of pleased surprise that Lady Helena Ashford would have felt, which was nothing like what Helena Todd felt, which was the specific, cold, clarifying hatred of a daughter who knows exactly what she is looking at. He was an adequate dancer. He spoke about himself with the enthusiasm of a man untroubled by the possibility of disinterest. She listened and smiled and asked the occasional question that opened doors she needed opened, and when the music turned and his hand rested at her waist she thought of 37 cobblestones and did not let a single thing she was thinking reach her face. Across the room, she was aware of him the way you are aware of a fixed point when the ground is uncertain. Shivas stood near the far column with a glass he wasn't drinking, his hand resting on his cane with a stillness that she had learned to read. He was not watching the dancing. He was watching Ashworth, and occasionally, briefly, he was watching her, and each time their eyes did not quite meet it was because both of them were professionals now, and professionals did not look at each other in the middle of the work. She laughed at something Ashworth said. It was her best performance yet. She had not meant to read it. She had been in the study to return a book, one of the French primers Monsieur Devereux had assigned, which she had borrowed from the shelf without thinking and was now returning with the same casual honesty, and the letter was simply there, on the desk, unfolded, as though it had been set down mid-reading. She would not have noticed it at all except that her father's name was on it, and when you have lost someone, their name in a stranger's handwriting stops you the way nothing else can. She read it once quickly. The way you touch something you suspect is hot. Then she read it again, slowly, because the first reading had not produced the reassurance she was looking for. The letter was dated 14 months prior, addressed to Shivas in a legal hand she did not recognize. It referenced Todd and Sons by name, and the debt acquisition Ashworth had engineered, and then, and here was where the floor became unreliable beneath her, it referenced a secondary party who had been informed of the shop's vulnerability in advance, who had, the letter implied, provided information that made the acquisition possible, whose cooperation had been, the letter concluded, invaluable to the broader inquiry. There was no signature she could identify. There was no explicit accusation. There was only the architecture of implication, and it was enough. She set the letter down with great care, the way you set down something that has already cut you and you are trying not to bleed on the furniture. The room looked different now. The books she had borrowed from these shelves, the fire she had warmed herself at, the desk across which he had slid documents and spoken to her in that measured, serious voice as though she were a person worthy of plain dealing, all of it had acquired a new and terrible ambiguity. She looked at the objects of her transformation and wondered if they were the instruments of her rescue or her management. He had known her father's name before he found her at the gates. He had said so himself that first morning. She had taken it as evidence of conscience, of some tangential guilt that explained his coldness and his charity both. She had not considered the alternative. That a man positioned exactly where Shivas Burgess was positioned, watching Ashworth, mapping his crimes, needing access to his circle, might find a very particular kind of use in a bereaved girl with every reason to cooperate and no one left to ask the right questions on her behalf. She stood in the study of Cravenmore House and felt the shape of the last weeks rearrange themselves into something she did not recognize. The ribbon was in her coat pocket. She pressed her hand against it through the fabric. Outside the window, London continued its indifferent business, and she stood very still in the wreckage of the only version of events she had allowed herself to believe. She left at midnight, when the storm was at its worst. It was not a coincidence. The storm was the point, the noise of it, the cover of it, the way it made the streets feel like a private place even in the middle of a city. She had packed nothing beyond what she had arrived with, which was nothing, and she had taken nothing from Cravenmore House except the French primer, which she set back on the shelf as she passed the study, and the blue ribbon, which she did not. The rain hit her the moment she cleared the servants' entrance. Cold and immediate and absolute, the kind of rain that doesn't build but simply arrives, fully committed. She walked quickly, head down, telling herself that the tightness in her chest was the cold and not anything more complicated, that she was making a rational decision based on evidence, that she was nobody's instrument and had been naive to forget it even temporarily. She had made it as far as the fountain. It stood at the center of the courtyard garden, a stone figure pouring endlessly into a basin that was now churning with rain, and she was passing it when she heard the door and then his footsteps, and she walked faster, and he was faster still, and then his hand was at her arm, not gripping, just present, and she stopped because she chose to, not because he made her, which was an important distinction she held onto very tightly. "The letter," he said. "Yes," she said. The rain was loud between them. She turned to face him because looking away felt like a concession she wasn't prepared to make. He was without a coat, which meant he had come immediately, without preparation, which meant something she refused to calculate. "I knew your father's situation before I found you," he said. "That part is true. Then the rest." "The rest," he said, "is a correspondence from a barrister documenting my attempts to intervene." He paused, and something moved through his expression that she had not seen there before. Not the controlled gravity of his public face, but something rawer underneath it, less managed. "I knew what Ashworth was doing to him. I had been building the case for months. I moved too slowly or he moved too quickly, and by the time I had enough to act." He stopped. The rain filled the silence. "By the time you had enough," she said quietly. He was already gone. The words were flat, factual, the tone of a man who has said something to himself so many times it has worn smooth. "The coldness you have been cataloging since you arrived. The distance. That is what guilt looks like, Miss Todd. When a man has carried it long enough that he has forgotten it is not simply his personality. She stood in the rain and looked at him, this severe, complicated, drenched man, and felt something in her chest perform the same quiet rearrangement as before, only this time in the opposite direction. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I should have." The invitation to Lord Pembroke's hunting lodge had seemed, on its surface, unremarkable. These things happened at this stage of the season. The city emptying incrementally into the countryside, the social calendar migrating towards shooting parties and long dinners in drafty manners. Lady Helena Ashford had received her card with the others, accepted with the appropriate gratitude, and thought nothing of it beyond the operational opportunity it represented. Ashworth would be there. She had 3 specific conversations she needed to engineer before the parliamentary inquiry convened. She understood something was wrong within the first hour. It was the quality of the attention. She had grown accustomed over these weeks to being looked at in the way unmarried women were looked at in these rooms, assessingly, briefly, categorically. But the look she received upon arrival at Pembroke Lodge had a different texture entirely. Calculating. Confirmatory. The looks of people checking something they already believed against the evidence in front of them. Ashworth came to her after dinner. He closed the drawing-room door behind him with the quiet care of a man who has done this before, and he smiled the smile she had watched across ballroom floors, easy, expansive, the smile of a man who has never doubted the outcome of anything, and he said her name. Her real name. "Helena Todd," he said, as though it were a small and pleasant surprise, as though he were not watching her face to see what fear looked like when it arrived. She gave him nothing. She had learned that much. 2 of his associates appeared from the adjoining room, and she understood with the cold clarity of someone who has already survived one worse night that the situation had moved beyond the social and into something that required a different set of resources than she currently possessed. She was calculating exits when she heard the horses. Not 1 or 2, many. The organized percussion of a coordinated arrival, and voices beyond the window carrying the specific authority of men who have warrants in their pockets. Ashworth heard it too. She watched it move through him, the smile contracting, the confidence curdling into something uglier, and she stepped to one side out of his reach, because she had not survived this far by standing in the wrong place at critical moments. Shivas came through the door himself rather than sending anyone ahead. He had not dressed for the country. He was in his London clothes, which meant he had ridden hard and not stopped, and he looked at her first, a single comprehensive look that asked a question and received its answer, before he looked at Ashworth at all. He handed the primary warrant to the inspector beside him without ceremony. Later, she would learn what he had traded for the speed of it, the political alliance he had spent a decade building, the carefully maintained neutrality that had made him effective, the career he had constructed with such cold and patient precision over so many years. He had spent all of it at once, without apparent hesitation, on a Thursday evening in the Pembroke countryside. Ashworth said something as they took him, some final assertion of consequence and connection, and Shivas did not respond, because Shivas was already crossing the room to where she stood, and the rest of it had ceased to be relevant. The scandal broke across London like a wave that had been building for a very long time. The papers ran it for 3 consecutive weeks. The fraud, the names, the parliamentary inquiry that Shivas had spent 2 years constructing and which now proceeded without him, carried forward by the evidence he had assembled with such meticulous, costly patience. Ashworth's associates fell in sequence, each one producing the next, the whole corrupt architecture dismantling itself with the bleak efficiency of things that were always going to end this way, given sufficient pressure and time. Shivas's name appeared in every account. Not as villain, but as something the papers found equally irresistible. The Duke who had surrendered his political career for a girl of no consequence, which was how they chose to frame it, because they did not know her and because consequence, in their vocabulary, was a function of birth and title and nothing else. Helena read the articles once each and used them to light the morning fire. What the papers did not report was the letter from her father's solicitor, which arrived 6 weeks after Ashworth's arrest and informed her that certain assets improperly seized were in the process of legal restoration. The shop itself was gone, sold, subdivided, beyond recovery. But what remained was enough. More than enough. Enough to begin something new on her own terms, in her own name, which was the only name she had ever wanted. She packed on a Tuesday. It seemed appropriate. The trunk was not large. She had arrived with nothing and was leaving with little more, which felt honest. The clothes she folded were her own now, purchased with restored funds, and the French primer she included without deliberating because she had earned it, page by difficult page, with bleeding fingers and an aching back. She was at the front door when she heard him. He came down the staircase without urgency, as he did everything, and he stopped at the bottom and looked at her across the entrance hall with those careful, weighted eyes, and she waited, because she had learned that he required space to arrive at the things he meant to say. "I would like you to stay," he said. Not as a mandate. Not as an arrangement with terms attached. Simply that, plainly, without the armor of implication, offered with the particular vulnerability of a man who has spent years confusing distance with protection and has only recently understood the difference. She looked at him for a long moment. "Ask me properly," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not the ghost of a smile this time, but the thing itself, brief and real and entirely unguarded. He offered her his arm. She took it. They went out through the side door into the gardens, where the last of the winter snow was retreating from the flower beds in slow, decisive inches, and the first green things were pressing upward through the cold earth with the quiet certainty of everything that had simply been waiting for the right season to begin. If Helena and Shivas have found their way into your heart, don't let this be the last chapter between you and us. Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because the next story is already waiting in the cold, and you won't want to miss the moment it comes in from the dark.